You open your eyes to darkness so complete it feels like a physical substance pressing against your face, and the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear sweat and the metallic tang of blood that might be yours or might belong to the man pressed against your shoulder in this cramped space with 30 soldiers huddle like animals waiting for slaughter. The transport truck lurches over roads cratered by months of shelling, each pothole sending jolts of pain through your ribs with a rifle butt connected during your capture. And you think about how quickly a human being can transition from hunter to prey, from soldier advancing with purpose to prisoner bound with wire that cuts into your wrists with every movement. You are somewhere in the forests of eastern Germany in the winter of 1945, though the exact location has been stripped from you, along with your weapons and your dignity and your name, because to your captors you are not a person, but a category: Soviet soldier, enemy combatant, problem to be processed according to protocols designed by men far from this frozen landscape who have never felt the particular terror of being cargo in a truck driving toward an unknown fate. The cold here is the cold of ending, the cold that seeps through the thin fabric of your uniform and settles into your bones like it intends to stay forever. And your breath comes in shallow gasps that create small clouds of vapor that dissipate immediately in the frigid air. You are 23 years old, though you feel ancient, aged by 2 years of warfare that have compressed decades of experience into months of surviving artillery barrages and street-to-street fighting, and the long, terrible nights between battles when you lie awake thinking about the faces of men you killed. German boys, not much different from yourself, except for the uniforms and the accidents of birth that placed them on one side of this conflict and you on the other. Your name is Alexei, and you grew up in a village outside Kursk, where your father worked as a blacksmith and your mother tended a small plot of land that produced potatoes and cabbages and occasionally wheat when the weather cooperated. And you remember summer evenings sitting on the wooden steps of your house watching the sun sink below the horizon while your younger sister sang songs she learned from the old women who gathered at the well. That life feels like something that happened to someone else in a story you heard long ago, a fairy tale from before the world broke open and revealed the machinery of violence hidden beneath the surface of ordinary days. The truck stops with a screech of brakes that send bodies tumbling forward in a tangle of limbs and groans, and the canvas flap at the rear tears open to reveal gray dawn light and 2 German guards with rifles pointed at the opening like they expect resistance from men too exhausted and broken to even stand properly. They shout commands in harsh German that cuts through the air like shards of broken glass. And you understand every word because your grandmother was German, came to Russia as a young bride in 1898, and taught you the language during the long winters when there was nothing to do but sit by the stove and listen to her stories about the Black Forest and the Rhine Valley and the small town where she grew up before love carried her eastward into a country that would eventually go to war with her homeland. You stumble out of the truck onto frozen ground that rings like iron under your boots, and around you stretches a compound of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fence and guard towers, and beyond the fence the forest stands like a wall of darkness where the pine trees are so laden with snow they bend under the weight like old men carrying burdens too heavy to bear.
The other prisoners shuffle into ragged lines with their heads down and their shoulders hunched against the wind that screams across the open ground with nothing to stop it. And you join them in this formation of the defeated, and you think about how war reduces all grand ideologies and patriotic speeches to this moment. Cold men standing in mud, waiting to learn if they will live or die, based on criteria that have nothing to do with justice or reason or any of the values that supposedly justified the fighting in the first place.
You are assigned to Barracks 7, along with 42 other Soviet prisoners, and the structure is little more than planks nailed together with gaps wide enough to admit wind and snow. And the bunks are wooden shelves stacked 3 high with no mattresses, just bare wood worn smoothed by the bodies of previous occupants whose fates you try not to imagine. The men around you speak in the low murmurs of those who have learned that drawing attention is dangerous, and you listen to fragments of conversation in Russian and Ukrainian and Georgian, this babble of the Eastern Front compressed into one freezing room where breath hangs visible in the air like the ghosts of words not yet spoken. There is a hierarchy here, already established through violence and proximity to the guards, and the man who controls the distribution of the thin soup that arrives twice daily is a Ukrainian sergeant named Petrov, who has the dead eyes of someone who stopped making moral calculations months ago and now operates purely on the mathematics of survival. You find a space on the middle bunk near the back wall where the wind cuts through with particular viciousness, and you lie down on the wooden slats and feel your body begin the slow process of adjustment to this new reality where comfort is measured in millimeters, a spot slightly less exposed to the draft, a position that puts marginally less pressure on your damaged ribs, the small victory of closing your eyes without someone immediately shouting at you to move. The days acquire a rhythm that is both monotonous and terrifying, each morning beginning with the screaming of whistles at 5 when darkness still presses against the windows like something solid, and you stumble out into the cold for roll call, where you stand in formation while guards count and recount bodies with the obsessive precision of bureaucrats maintaining inventories. The work assignments vary, but the underlying structure remains constant. 12 hours of labor designed to extract maximum utility from bodies that are systematically starved and frozen and worked toward the edge of collapse, but not quite beyond it, because corpses have no value, and the German war machine still requires the production of fortifications and the clearing of rubble and the digging of trenches, even as the front lines draw closer with each passing week. You are sent to the forest to fell trees, swinging an axe that feels impossibly heavy in hands weakened by inadequate food, and the physical labor is almost welcome because it generates heat and keeps your mind occupied with immediate concerns: the angle of the blade, the rhythm of the swing, the small satisfaction of watching a tree shudder and fall in an explosion of snow and broken branches. The bard assigned to your work detail is an older man named Schmidt, who watches with the bored attention of someone performing a duty he finds tedious, and he smokes cigarettes and stamps his feet against the cold, and occasionally shouts at prisoners who slow their pace, but there is no particular cruelty in him, just the blank efficiency of a man doing a job he neither loves nor hates.
You learn the routines of survival through observation and painful trial, which guards to avoid, because they carry their frustrations about the losing war as weapons to be deployed against prisoners. Which corners of the compound offer brief respite from the wind? How to make the watery soup last longer by eating it slowly and savoring each spoonful as if it contains actual nourishment rather than being merely hot water with occasional traces of cabbage or potato. The hunger is constant and all-consuming, a presence that occupies every moment and shapes every thought, and you find yourself dreaming about food with an intensity that borders on madness, elaborate feasts of roasted meat and fresh bread, and the apple cake your mother made on special occasions. And you wake from these dreams with saliva in your mouth and an emptiness in your stomach that feels like being hollowed out from the inside. The other prisoners become familiar through proximity, but not through friendship, because friendship requires a kind of emotional investment that feels dangerous when death arrives with such casual frequency. When the man sleeping in the bunk beside you might be gone tomorrow from typhus or exhaustion or the simple failure of his body to continue its basic functions under conditions designed to break even the strongest constitution. The German you learned from your grandmother becomes both blessing and curse, because you understand the guards' conversations and their casual discussions about prisoner disposals and their complaints about supply shortages and their fears about the approaching Soviet forces. And this knowledge sits in your mind like a stone you cannot put down. You are careful never to reveal your comprehension, maintaining the blank expression of incomprehension when guards speak, because languages are power, and power must be hoarded and deployed strategically rather than displayed carelessly. But one afternoon in late February, when the light is beginning to last fractionally longer, and the snow has taken on the gray cast of winter's ending, you are hauling timber past the administrative building when you hear Schmidt talking to another guard about his daughter in Hamburg, about how the last letter said she was sick with pneumonia and the hospitals have no medicine left, and he is terrified she will die while he is stuck here watching over prisoners when the war is clearly lost anyway. The pain in his voice is so raw and familiar that before you can stop yourself, you turn and meet his eyes, and in that moment something passes between you, recognition perhaps, or the simple acknowledgement that suffering is universal and does not respect the boundaries of uniforms or nationalities or the arbitrary designations of enemy and ally that men in distant offices have drawn across maps with such confident authority.
You are standing at the edge of the forest 3 days later when Schmidt approaches you alone, away from the other prisoners who are resting during the brief midday break that regulations require even in labor camps where human life has been reduced to units of productive capacity. The trees here are ancient pines that rise like cathedral columns toward a sky the color of old pewter, and the snow beneath your boots has been trampled into a dirty slush that seeps through the holes in your worn footwear and turns your feet into numb blocks of flesh that barely respond to commands. Schmidt stands close enough that you can smell the tobacco on his breath and see the lines etched deep around his eyes, lines that speak of sleepless nights and accumulated sorrows, and he speaks in German so quietly you have to strain to hear him over the wind that moves through the upper branches with a sound like distant weeping. He asks you directly if you understand what he is saying,
and the question hangs in the frozen air between you like something with weight and consequence. And you know that this moment is a crossroads, where the path you choose will determine whether you see another month or whether you disappear into the category of prisoners who simply stop appearing at roll call, with no explanation and no record beyond a number scratched off a ledger. You answer him in German that carries your grandmother's accent, the soft rolling consonants of the Rhineland, overlaid with the harder edges acquired through disuse and the interference of your native Russian. And you watch his face register surprise and something that might be relief, or might be calculation, or might be both, existing simultaneously in the complicated space where human beings encounter each other beyond the scripts written by ideology and war. He tells you that he needs someone who can translate, that the camp commandant has ordered increased interrogations of newly arrived prisoners to extract intelligence about Soviet troop movements and supply lines, and that the current translator is a sadist who enjoys his work too much and extracts confessions through methods that produce unreliable information, because men in extreme pain will say anything to make the suffering stop. Schmidt says this with a disgust that seems genuine, and you understand that he is offering you a bargain, cooperation in exchange for survival, the chance to move from the brutality of manual labor to the slightly less brutal environment of administrative work. And beneath this practical exchange runs a current of something more complex, a mutual recognition that you are both trapped in machinery neither of you designed, and both trying to preserve some fragment of humanity in circumstances engineered to destroy it. The interrogation room is in the basement of the administrative building, and it smells of damp stone and old fear and the particular chemical odor of disinfectant applied too late to spaces where blood has already soaked into the concrete. You sit at a small wooden table with a German officer named Hauptmann Richter, who has the pale skin and restless hands of someone running on nervous energy and insufficient sleep. And across from you sits a Soviet lieutenant captured 2 days ago during a skirmish 15 kilometers north. And his face is already swollen from beatings, and his left eye is completely shut, and blood has dried in dark streaks down his chin. Richter asks questions in German, and you translate them into Russian, and the lieutenant responds with name and rank and serial number, the only information the Geneva Conventions require, though you all know those conventions are fictions that both sides have abandoned in practice, if not in rhetoric. The questions grow more specific and more aggressive: unit designations, officer names, artillery positions, supply routes, and the lieutenant maintains his refusal, and you translate his defiance into German while simultaneously softening the tone, removing the edge of contempt from his voice and replacing it with simple exhaustion, because you understand instinctively that protecting him means making him seem defeated rather than resistant, broken rather than brave.
Richter grows frustrated and reaches for the telephone to call the guards who will take the interrogation to its next phase, the phase that happens in the smaller room adjoining this one, where the sounds are muffled by thick walls, and what emerges afterward can barely be called human anymore. You speak quickly in German, telling Richter that the prisoner is clearly too disoriented from his injuries to provide coherent information, that giving him a day to recover will yield better intelligence than beating him further into incoherence. And you say this with the authority of someone offering professional advice rather than pleading for mercy, because you have learned that mercy must be disguised as pragmatism to be accepted by men who have convinced themselves that cruelty is simply efficiency by another name. Richter pauses with his hand on the telephone and looks at you with eyes that are trying to determine whether you are genuinely useful or simply soft, whether your suggestion comes from strategic thinking or misplaced compassion. And the moment stretches like wire being pulled taut, while the lieutenant sits bleeding across the table and the future hangs in balance. Finally, Richter nods and waves his hand dismissively, and guards come to drag the lieutenant back to the prisoner barracks. And as he passes you, his one functioning eye meets yours, and in it you see a question forming, whether you are collaborator or something more complicated, whether your translation was betrayal or the only form of protection available in this place, where protection comes in degrees measured by how much suffering you can delay or diminish rather than prevent entirely. You return to this room daily for 3 weeks, translating questions and answers and learning to navigate the narrow space between cooperation and resistance, between keeping yourself alive and selling out your fellow prisoners. And the line is so thin it barely exists, and you cross it constantly in small ways that accumulate like debts you cannot repay. You soften some translations and harden others. You provide information that is technically accurate but strategically useless. You learn which prisoners can withstand pressure and which are close to breaking, and you allocate the limited protection you can offer accordingly, making calculations that feel like playing God, except God presumably has better information and clearer moral guidelines than you possess in this basement where every choice is contaminated and every action carries consequences you cannot fully predict. Schmidt brings you extra bread sometimes, small portions smuggled from the guards' rations, and he tells you more about his daughter, whose name is Anna, and who is 7 years old, and who writes letters in careful script about her schoolwork and the cat that lives in their building, and you understand that he is using you as confessor the same way you are using him as protector, that you have become mirrors for each other's desperate need to remain human in conditions designed to reduce everyone to their most animal functions of survival and domination.
You were sitting in the interrogation room on a morning in late March when the walls begin to shake from distant artillery, and the sound is still far enough away to be almost abstract, but close enough that everyone in the camp understands the meaning. The Soviet forces are advancing faster than the German High Command predicted, and the front line that seemed stable for weeks is suddenly collapsing like a structure whose foundations have rotted through. Richter's hands tremble more noticeably now as he lights cigarettes one after another, and his questions have taken on a frantic quality, as if the intelligence he extracts might somehow alter the trajectory of a war already lost. And you translate his desperation into Russian while watching the prisoner across from you, a young private, barely 18, whose face still carries the softness of boyhood despite the bruises blooming across his cheeks like dark flowers. The boy is terrified but stubborn, refusing to provide anything beyond the minimal required responses,
and you admire his courage, even as you fear what it will cost him, because courage in this place is often indistinguishable from suicide, both being forms of refusal to accept the logic of survival that demands compromise and collaboration and the slow erosion of principles in exchange for continued existence. The camp commandant issues new orders that afternoon, and Schmidt tells you in a voice gone flat with horror that all remaining prisoners are to be moved west ahead of the Soviet advance, that those too weak to march will be left behind in the barracks with the doors locked, and you understand what this means without him having to speak it directly, because the Germans have grown efficient at murder, and leaving witnesses behind is a luxury they can no longer afford. The guards begin sorting prisoners that evening, dividing them into columns based on crude assessments of physical capability, and you watch men plead and bargain and offer imaginary strengths they do not possess, and you watch others accept their fate with the exhausted resignation of people who have already died internally and are simply waiting for their bodies to catch up. You are placed in the march column because your work as translator has kept you marginally better fed and less damaged than those who spent months in the forest felling timber. But the Ukrainian sergeant Petrov is left behind despite his protests, and the man who controlled the soup distribution and ruled Barrack 7 through intimidation and cunning is reduced to weeping as guards drag him back toward the building that will become his tomb. The march begins at dawn with 300 prisoners organized into a column that stretches along the forest road like a serpent shedding its skin, and around you the guards walk with rifles ready and eyes that dart nervously toward the eastern horizon where the artillery thunder grows steadily louder. You walk with hands thrust into pockets and head down against the wind that still carries winter's bite, despite the calendar claiming spring's arrival. And your feet move automatically in the rhythm of forced marches you learned during training that feels like it happened in another lifetime to another person who believed in victory and justice and the righteousness of causes. The man walking beside you is a Georgian named Georgi, who has lost so much weight his uniform hangs on his frame like a tent on poles, and he whispers in broken Russian that he will not survive this march, that his lungs are damaged from pneumonia, and each breath feels like inhaling broken glass, and you have no comfort to offer him, because comfort would be a lie, and you have reached the point where lies feel more obscene than silence. The forest on either side of the road stands dense and dark, and you think about how easy it would be to simply step sideways into those trees and vanish into the shadows. But the guards shoot runners without hesitation, and the forest floor is still covered in snow that would make tracking trivially easy. And escape is a fantasy for people who still have enough energy to sustain hope. You walk for 6 hours before the column stops at a village that has been abandoned, its houses standing empty, with doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. And the guards herd prisoners into a barn where you collapse onto hay that smells of rot and old animal waste. Schmidt finds you in the darkness and presses something into your hand, a piece of hard bread and a folded paper, and he whispers in German that the paper is a travel pass identifying you as a Volksdeutsch, an ethnic German pressed into Soviet service and now liberated by the Wehrmacht. And if you are separated from the column, this document might save your life if you encounter the right kind of German soldier, though he acknowledges that you are just as likely to encounter the wrong kind, who will shoot you regardless of what papers you carry. You stare at this gift that is simultaneously worthless and priceless, this piece of paper that represents Schmidt's attempt to extend protection beyond the immediate moment into a future he cannot control. and you understand that he is trying to absolve himself through this gesture, trying to balance some cosmic ledger where his complicity in the camp's machinery of suffering might be offset by this single act of individual mercy. You thank him in German, and he nods and walks away, and you never see him again, because that night the guards receive new orders, and in the confusion of departure, the column reorganizes, and Schmidt is assigned to a different group of prisoners, being marched along a different route toward a different, uncertain destination. The second day of marching claims Georgi and 17 others who simply stop moving, their bodies shutting down from exhaustion and starvation and the accumulated damage of months in captivity. And the guards shoot them where they fall, because the orders are clear that no prisoners are to be left alive behind the column. You hear the shots crack out like branches breaking, and you do not turn around, because turning around serves no purpose except to burn images into your memory that you already carry too many of. And you walk forward with your eyes fixed on the boots of the man ahead of you, these worn boots that slap against mud and snow in a rhythm that becomes your entire universe. And you think about how survival often means the simple act of continuing to place one foot in front of another when every muscle and bone and neuron in your body is screaming for you to stop. The third day brings rain that turns the road into a river of mud, and the fourth day brings the sound of tanks in the distance, though whether they are German or Soviet no one can determine. And on the fifth day, the guards simply vanish during the night, melting away into the countryside like snow under sudden sun. And you wake to find 300 prisoners standing in a field with no captors and no destination, and no clear understanding of whether this constitutes liberation or simply a different form of abandonment.
You stand in that field with rain falling in sheets that blur the horizon into gray nothingness, and around you men are weeping or laughing or simply standing frozen in place as if movement has become impossible now that the external structure forcing it has disappeared. And you think about how freedom arrived not as a dramatic rescue, but as absence, as the negative space left behind when your captors decided you were no longer worth the effort of killing. The group fragments almost immediately into smaller clusters organized by language and geography and the invisible bonds of shared suffering. And some men begin walking east toward the Soviet lines, while others head west toward the American and British forces. And you understand that this choice carries enormous weight, because returning to Soviet territory means facing questions about how you survived captivity and whether survival itself constitutes collaboration, means entering a system that views prisoners of war with suspicion and often sends them directly from German camps to Soviet gulags without pause for rest or recognition of what they endured. You begin walking south with no clear destination in mind, just a vague notion that south means away from the armies grinding toward their final confrontation, means smaller towns and rural areas where a man with forged papers and functional German might disappear into the chaos of displaced persons flooding across a continent that has torn itself apart. You walk for 3 weeks through a landscape that looks like the end of the world, past burned villages and bombed cities and fields cratered by artillery, where unexploded shells lurk beneath mud like sleeping predators waiting to detonate under careless feet. You see columns of refugees moving in all directions, carrying possessions in carts and wheelbarrows and bundles balanced on their heads. And you see German soldiers in ragged uniforms stumbling westward with the defeated eyes of men who know their cause is lost but have nowhere else to go.
and you see the bodies that lie in ditches and beside roads, bodies that no one has time or energy to bury because the living have their hands full just remaining among the living. You use Schmidt's forged papers twice at checkpoints manned by Wehrmacht soldiers, too exhausted to examine documents carefully. And once you are stopped by American troops who question you in English you barely understand before waving you onward with expressions of indifference because you are just one more displaced person in an ocean of displacement. Just one more problem in a landscape composed entirely of problems too numerous to address individually. You find work on a farm in Bavaria where the farmer has lost both sons to the war and needs hands to plant the spring crops, and you spend 3 months sleeping in a barn loft and working soil that yields reluctantly to the plow. And the farmer's wife feeds you potatoes and cabbage and occasionally meat, and slowly your body begins to recover the weight it lost, though the nightmares continue with relentless consistency. Your sleep populated by the faces of men you failed to save, and the sounds of shots in the forest, and Georgie's labored breathing in the darkness of the barn.
You live in Germany for 2 years, working various jobs and moving between towns with the restless energy of someone afraid that staying in one place too long will allow the past to catch up. And you perfect the identity the forged papers created. A Volksdeutsche from a village near Odessa who lost his family in the Soviet advance and seeks only to rebuild the simple life far from politics and ideology and the grand narratives that devoured so many millions. In 1947, you meet a woman named Greta who works in a bakery in a small Bavarian town, and she has sad eyes and gentle hands and asks no questions about your past beyond what you volunteer. And you marry her in a quiet ceremony attended by people who know you only as the quiet man who fixes things and speaks German with a strange accent and sometimes wakes screaming in the night. You have 2 children, a daughter named Anna after Schmidt's daughter, though you never tell Greta this, and a son named Peter who grows up strong and healthy in a world slowly rebuilding itself from rubble. And you work as a carpenter and then as a foreman in a furniture factory, and your life acquires the mundane rhythms of domesticity that feel simultaneously precious and fraudulent because you know you are living under a name that is not yours, in a country that was your enemy, wearing an identity constructed from lies. You never return to Russia, and you never attempt to contact your family because you understand that your official status is deserter or collaborator, and either designation would bring consequences not just to you, but to anyone associated with you. And so you accept that the life you had before the war is simply gone, erased as completely as if you had died in one of those forests or fields where so many others fell. You carry the weight of this erasure for 43 years, through the birth of grandchildren and the death of Greta from cancer in 1978, and the slow accumulation of ordinary joys and sorrows that constitute a human life. And only near the end, when you are dying in a hospital bed in Munich in 1988, do you tell your daughter the truth, handing her a small metal box that contains your original Soviet military identification papers and a photograph of your family in Russia and a letter written in Russian that explains everything. She listens with tears running down her face as you speak in a language she does not understand, translated haltingly into German by a nurse who happens to be Ukrainian. And you tell her about Alexei,
who died in the war, and about the man who took his place and built a life from stolen identity and forged papers, and the complicated mercy of a German guard who saw his own daughter's face in the suffering of prisoners. You close your eyes for the last time, thinking not about the life you lived in Germany, but about that moment in the forest when Schmidt approached you and asked if you understood German, that pivot point where your entire future hinged on a single decision to reveal or conceal, to trust or protect yourself. And you understand finally that there are no clean choices in war, no actions untainted by compromise or collaboration, or the daily betrayals required to survive in systems designed to destroy. And you think about all the versions of yourself that died along the way, the boy from Kursk, the Soviet soldier, the prisoner, the translator, until only this remained, an old man in a clean bed in a country built on the ruins of the one that held him captive. And you wonder if Schmidt survived, and if his daughter Anna recovered from pneumonia, and if the lieutenant with the swollen eye made it home, or died in some other basement, in some other camp. And these questions dissolve into the larger question of whether any of it meant anything beyond the simple fact of continued existence. And the darkness that comes is neither judgment nor absolution, but simply the end of consciousness, the final silence after a lifetime of translating between languages and identities, and the irreconcilable truths that war creates and peace cannot fully resolve. And in that darkness you are finally just yourself, no longer soldier or prisoner or German or Russian, but only the essential thing beneath all those labels, the quiet consciousness that observed it all and carried the weight of memory, and now finally sets it down and rests.